Thank you so much for joining our session, Rising to New Challenges and Public Needs in a Year of Crisis. In this session, we will highlight findings from INN's latest index report. My name is Emily Roseman. I am the research director here at INN. I'm a co-author of this year's index report, and I am joined by my colleague, Jesse Holcomb. Jesse, I'll pass you the mic to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Emily. So I have been studying the nonprofit news field for about a decade, first with the Pew Research Center, and now having worked with INN on the index since 2018. So it's a real pleasure to join you, Emily. And before we get started, I should really also give a shout out to Michelle McClellan, our co-author and a lead on this project, who would be with us were it not for a major time zone difference. So I'm sort of channeling Michelle into this session as well. I'm based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm a journalism communication prof at Calvin University.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. Before we get started, just a reminder to please keep yourselves on mute throughout this session and to please drop any questions you have in chat. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can after this 15 to 20 minute presentation. So let's dig in. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the index report, it is the most comprehensive study of nonprofit news. It's a survey of our members each year. We've been doing it since 2018. And thanks to the amazing responses of our members this year, this report approaches being a full census of the nonprofit news field. The full 2021 index report will be coming out next week, so you can consider this a review of our top level findings. So before we get into the data, let me just pause here to acknowledge the incredible work of nonprofit news outlets in 2020. Members started up direct services for their audiences. Other outlets covered and gave context to the anti-racism movement last year. Reporters around the country put on their masks and conducted these socially distant interviews with their sources. It was just such a crazy and challenging year, and we just saw how nonprofit newsrooms kept producing coverage and stories for the public throughout it. So what does this coverage look like? Well, it's about a third national and global, a third state and regional, and a third local news outlets. Nonprofit news coverage is in depth, it's investigative, it's explanatory, and really above all, it exists to serve the public. The vast majority of this coverage is free and open to the public, and much of the coverage is disseminated across the country by third-party publishers who rely on nonprofit journalism to fill in their coverage gaps. Much of what I've just told you has stayed consistent year to year. So what's the latest? You're here to kind of hear the breaking news. Well, in 2020, we saw some pretty incredible growth across the sector. We're going to dig into that growth now. So Jesse, I'll pass the mic back to you.
All right, thanks, Emily. So 2020 was a year of some pretty significant news events between COVID-19, the movement for racial justice, the presidential election. And these events all drove considerable audience growth across the field. What we found was web traffic increase of upwards of 43% across members, and increased newsletter signups growing by 36%. So a pretty dramatic spike. Of course, the future challenge, not just for INN members, but for any news publisher, is really how to keep and build on this growth. Nonprofit news direct audiences, this is worth really highlighting, are still relatively select and targeted. What we've found in the research is that the median web traffic for a typical INN member is around only just 50,000 unique visitors per month. And that really varies, of course. You've got some major blockbuster publishers that have wide national and global reach. And so if you were to look at average, it would be bigger, but the median is the best representation of the typical publisher. It's pretty small. And also worth noting that many of these members provide reporting to other media and work with partnerships and collaborations. So that makes it a challenge to measure what would be perhaps the larger, quote unquote, real audience footprint for most publishers. That audience growth that we've noted wasn't only a reaction to events. It was also nurtured by an increase in publishing volume field-wide. INN did an internal study with Deep News AI and found that INN member newsrooms are now producing roughly 1,000 stories a day on average. And that's roughly double the volume of 4 years ago. So increased audience driven in part by events, but also increased coverage and production. The increase in journalism output, in turn, was supported by a larger field altogether. Based on our estimates, we pegged the total number of news workers across at 2,700. That would be among the cohort of established, primarily digital publications in INN. And that includes about 2,000 editorial and reporting personnel. So that figure for 2020 represents growth over the roughly 2,300 staff and of that 1,700 journalists that we tallied in 2019. Now, it's also, I want to be clear that those numbers don't actually even account for the many staff serving at new startups from the past year, nor the hundreds of staffers at the 24 public media members that belong to INN as well. So if we were to include that, it would be a bigger number still, quite a bit bigger. We've been tracking INN newsroom staff demographics and composition since 2018, when we launched the index. And this year we observed some noticeable movement when it comes to newsroom diversity. In 2020, we found that 37% of nonprofit news outlets had a staff where people of color made up at least 40% of personnel. In 2019, that number was at 21% of outlets that had that share. At the same time, despite some gains in newsroom diversity, leadership is predominantly white across the field. For our analysis, we were able to isolate newsroom execs and other staff. And among execs in the field, 74% are white. And among non-executive staff, 57% are white. And for some little bit of context, the US labor force overall falls somewhere in between at around 2/3 white overall. Of all the INN startups launched between 2017 and 2020, about half are led primarily by journalists of color. So some good news there. The field has seen a lot of new startups in the past few years, and that may be part of what's driving the growth in newsroom diversity across INN membership. I want to shift gears for a minute here to look at some of the latest financial trends that we see across the field. Despite a really challenging year on so many fronts, we saw some significant revenue gains across INN members that we were able to track year over year. Individual giving really stands out. From 2019 to 2020, individual donations grew for more than 60% of the news organizations that had comparable revenue data. And more than half of those organizations that increased individual giving grew it by more than 50%. So it's pretty substantial. Earned revenue was something of a wash in a pretty difficult advertising, sponsorship, and events climate in 2020. Not a huge surprise there. But looking big picture overall, it was a really strong year in a very challenging environment. 7 out of 10 nonprofit news outlets increased their overall revenue from 2017 to 2020. And in many cases, that increase was substantial. The revenue growth is particularly notable given the severity of cutbacks at commercial newsrooms around the US over the past year. There have been estimates that at the end of 2020, roughly 37,000 employees at news media companies around the country had been laid off, furloughed, or had their pay reduced since the arrival of COVID-19. It's a tough climate. In the midst of that, having tracked this field for a number of years now, showed remarkable resilience and even growth over the past year on a number of fronts. And I'll turn it back to you, Emily.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. So Jesse just walked us through how the field as a whole has experienced this incredible growth. I'm going to take us a bit deeper, particularly into the revenue data. So overall, across the field of independent, mostly digital native publishers across INN, we project that total revenue is $350 million. And that $350 million, it isn't quite divided up across the hundreds of INN members in an equal way. The field of nonprofit news is actually broken up into a few different revenue rungs, which you can see here. So you can often see the larger national and global outlets bringing in the 2 million or more per year. They're at the upper rung of that 20% of outlets. And then oftentimes we see locals and startup news outlets chugging along with 250K or less per year. Those are the groups, the 36% that you see at the bottom of this revenue ladder here. And now, interestingly, where that revenue comes from for each outlet and where we see revenue growth varies by outlet type. So you can see here, we've sorted out revenue pies per the 3 different main types of outlets according to coverage scope: national news outlets, state news outlets, and local news outlets. For all of the 3 types of outlets here, it's really important to flag that foundation funding remains a critical backbone of revenue pies for nonprofit news, ranging from 41% to 47% for each type of outlet. Interestingly, national news outlets on the left-hand side here, we're seeing growth coming from major donors. Major donors make up the majority of individual giving dollars for this segment. That's out of the 40% you see there. State news outlets are impressively growing substantial amount of revenue from both earned revenue sources and individual giving. And on the right-hand side, local news outlets we are seeing are growing earned revenue and are also leading the way in terms of new launches. About half of startups in 2020 were local news outlets. So I just want to pause here and point out that it might look to you here that since the foundation funding, this critical backbone of support for all of these news outlets is a similarly sized slice of each of these revenue pies, you might be guessing that each of these types of outlets are receiving roughly equal amounts of philanthropic support. But our data show that that is not true. So let's zero in here on where the field's grant money is going. So you can see here, we find that national and global news get the lion's share of grant funding. You can read this chart. The blue bars represent the share of INN members. And so as we reviewed earlier, about 37% of INN members are local, 30% state and regional, 31% national and global. The orange bar represents the share of grant funding each of those types of outlet is receiving or received in 2020 according to our index data. So you can see here that even though national and global outlets make up 31% of the field, they are receiving 65% of the field's grant funding. And we are going to come back to this in a few minutes because we think it's a really important point. So that's the data. I now want to take a few minutes to share INN's hypotheses on why we're seeing this growth across the field. One reason for this growth, we think, is because of the incredible service journalism member newsrooms have produced in 2020 and beyond. Where there were critical information needs in 2020, nonprofit news outlets rose to fill them. They were really the nimble, savvy, creative, innovative models we needed this past year. These are just a few of many examples. We saw Cal Matters produce these unemployment benefit explainers. Sahan Journal produced videos on vaccine distribution and eligibility in 4 different languages. The Texas Tribune launched a new direct texting service for their readers to ask them questions after the power grid crisis. We think the public noticed and appreciated these services and rewarded these outlets with their financial support. And another reason we see this growth is because of collective fundraising programs like Newsmatch. And while growth in individual giving has been a central marker of Newsmatch's success, INN has actually noticed something bigger happening. And that's that Newsmatch has created pathways for local and regional funders, philanthropists, and small businesses to invest in independent news outlets with these local matching funds. So in short, and this is very important, we are seeing national philanthropic dollars being used as catalysts to garner local, public, and community support. And as you can see here, the really exciting thing is that we're seeing the effect of this catalyst grow over time. So looking ahead, we just spent a few minutes looking backwards at 2020. Looking ahead, what are our priorities as news leaders, as funders, as democracy backers and leaders? Well, as news leaders, we encourage you to take a moment and just pat yourselves on the back. I mean, this was just an incredible year and we're in awe of your successes. We recommend that you prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, especially at the executive level where it is needed most right now. We also recommend, this is on many of leaders' minds already, how can we focus on audience retention and keep those new audiences that so many of you attracted in this crisis year? And finally, how can we keep up this momentum in individual giving? We recommend focusing especially on major gifts, which we see as just such a critical backbone of support for nonprofit news. For the funders in the room, keep doing what you're doing. As you can see here, your dollars are being put to work, and not only are they being used in this incredible way, but they're catalyzing broad public support for nonprofit news. As I mentioned a few slides back, we think it's critical to focus on local and startup funding at this time. We think there is a need to scale local and startup funding. We also encourage you to keep strengthening the backbone of national outlets whose reporting really strengthens and supports the entire news ecosystem. And finally, for the democracy backers and civic leaders in this space, we recommend you get involved, gather your community, and start a discussion. What is the essential role, or what is the role of reliable information to people in your community? What is happening with news right now, and what does that mean for you? And how are threats to news a threat to democracy? We recommend that you really start to identify what people in your community see as key information needs. And if there are any unmet information needs, to look at founding a nonprofit, nonpartisan news startup. Where you do have existing news providers, we recommend that you rally support for them because as we have seen this past year, they are more essential than ever before. So thank you so much for listening. That was our presentation. Please post any questions you have into chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the next 13 minutes here. If we don't get to your question, or if you would rather send us a note directly, please shoot us an email at index@inn.org, and that goes directly to the Index team. All right, thank you so much. Sarah, I know you've been keeping track of questions. Can I pass you the mic to see what sorts of questions we've been getting?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of great questions. A lot of them have been answered in the chat by Sue and Jeffrey and a lot of folks at INN. So thank you for that. One that I didn't see answered is in individual giving, defining that. Is that a mix of major gifts and membership?
Yes, that's a great question. That's a larger bucket that includes major giving, mid-level giving, and major giving we define as 5,000 or more, mid-level giving, and then smaller giving, smaller donor giving, as well as membership revenue. So that's a sort of a catch-all bucket for that. When you see the report come out, you should see that some of that stuff kind of broken out, so it's not just one big bucket, but looking at the individual revenue streams.
Awesome. And then when we talk about online unique user sizes, how does that compare to print circulation where applicable? Was that something that was studied in the index?
No, actually, that wasn't something that we haven't sort of launched into a sort of in-depth audience analytics comparison with the commercial legacy media, but based on what we sort of know from the field is that large established legacy media companies have sort of a large built-in audience. And it's going to be bigger than a lot of these digital startups and even established nonprofit and local companies. Matt Heineman has done a really great analysis if you want to look at some of his work on the challenge of developing direct audience traffic in the digital publishing sphere. So I would say these are typically, median audiences are typically smaller for digital publishers overall. That includes a lot of INM members. There's a variety there. Commercial media sector have bigger audience overall, whether you're talking local TV, national television, or the newspaper sector.
Awesome. And so during your research, have you noticed any different trends in states that have like a statewide news initiative such as North Carolina or Colorado? Have you noticed any trends in the different news organizations there in what they're producing?
So in the index data, I don't think, Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't track new initiatives like that. So we aren't able to basically split state news from outlets with new initiatives. But one exciting part of our index report this year is since we had this amazing data set from 94% of the outlets invited to participate, we were able to create really a robust subgroup analysis of the local outlets, the state outlets, and the national outlets. And so we'll be publishing that separately, basically a 2-pager on each of the trends we see for local outlets and the others. And we think you'll be able to find some really interesting comparisons there.
Excellent. Let's see. Feel free to keep the questions coming if you have any more.
I see one great question from Sam. Why do you think the bulk of foundation funding goes to national global outlets? INN has a few theories on this, and Sue and Jesse, I encourage you to jump in if I missed anything here. But we really think it's because national and global outlets tend to be older. They have existing relationships already built with many program officers at these foundations. And they've already done the work kind of building these relationships and making the case over time for why they should receive funding. And secondly, you typically see more established fundraising staffs and other things like that at national and global outlets. But just a shout out to INN's Network Philanthropy Center, which helps our outlets kind of develop some of these fundraising skills.
I see a question here. In your census, how many states now have a statewide nonprofit news outlet? How many are on the statewide level?
That's a really good question. We must have that data somewhere. I don't have it on the ready. But I wonder if someone on INN's team could dig that up. We should have it somewhere.
I want to say it's in the 30s.
Yeah, see, I think we do have that number, but it'll take us a minute to pull it up here and post it in chat.
We have one question. Let's see. For funders, can you clarify the recommendation for funders to continue to fortify national news outlets when it appears that national outlets receive a disproportionate share of funding?
Yeah, so I'll just say we certainly think this is the year for kind of specific attention to local news and startups, but we don't think this is a cause for foundations to stop their incredible support of national outlets that we think really bolster the network. We see, especially at collaborations, national outlets have these bigger audiences that when they're partnering with locals on collaborations, it's imperative that we have these larger outlets in the field to kind of strengthen the field as a whole. I don't know if Jesse or Sue, you want to comment on that as well.
Thanks, Emily.
Sorry, I was pulling up our statewide numbers. What
Thanks,
was your
Sue.
question again?
Why is it important for funders to continue to fund national and global outlets, even though they're seeing this wide share of support already?
I mean, I do think that for the reasons you cited, funding of local and state poses some challenges, and we have to build the local and state level funding. The national ones remain important, though, because there's this idea that national is taken care of because the New York Times is big and Washington Post has Bezos and is doing fine and CNN's out there. But the nationals are doing coverage that isn't really being done in commercial media in many cases, investigative, highly specialized data work and so forth. And many of the nationals, and increasingly, you guys know it, are partnering with locals. So even the ones that have been around a long time, CIR has local collaborations. Everyone knows about ProPublicas, but many others do as well. Center for Public Integrity gets data and shares it with everybody. You'll see it on our listserv. Even Mother Jones, in their fundraising, when they thank people who donate to them, they identify other news nonprofits, particularly those led by people of color, and say, hey, have you checked them out and considered funding them too? So they play this backbone role that's an important one. And that's why we need to grow the pie. I don't want to see funding shift from nationals to locals or just this or that. We are just scratching the surface of building philanthropic support for news. So we need to build more of it at the local level, rather than pulling from one that isn't well resourced to fund the others.
Speaking
That's great. I also want to just highlight, oh, sorry, Sarah.
No.
Highlight a point made by MLK 50, which I'm assuming is Wendy. I guess, and she says, I guess that national outlets often started with 7 figures in the bank, which allowed them to build the business side from day one. So that's an important point to bring up as well.
And then, yeah, just one other on the funding pie chart. What falls in the other charitable bucket that was listed?
I can take that one. That's a generally pretty small category, and it's kind of a place for certain types of charitable giving that don't easily fit into the other categories. So in some cases, it's related to PPP loans or corporate grants, that sort of thing falls into that category. I think those are sort of probably two of the bigger categories, but anything that doesn't really fall neatly into a traditional foundation grant or an individual donation.
Okay. Oh, here's the one related to that. Let's see. I don't know if you have these numbers, but do you know about how many INN members were eligible and applied for a PPP loan in this past year?
I don't have that.
Rest what we know on that. I know that we know at least 100 did, because we had workshops and helped many members apply for the first round. I have no sense of how many applied for the second round.
And then in your research, did you find how much funding is going to nonprofits that are informing and covering minority communities?
We do have data on that. That's going to be part of the report. I am trying to pull it up so I have the right numbers on the ready. I don't want to give a bad number, but we were basically able to measure the extent to which publishers, according to their mission, say that their primary purpose is to serve communities of color, or whether that's sort of part of an ancillary part of their mission or not at all. And we were able to analyze this revenue and budget tied to those organizations. And so I want to pull up a stat if I can and put it in the chat to avoid sort of rattling off an incorrect number.
Hey, Sarah, let me answer a follow-up question, really good question from Wendy about, does the lift all boats work? It's not lifting all boats in the same way, and it can't be. You're right. There are equity issues. So we actually see grant funding to organizations that are primarily serving communities of color or led by people of color. In other areas of philanthropy, you see big racial disparities in giving. In the journalism grant funding, we're not seeing that. But I think that's the success of grant funders actually taking an equity lens to this, because we know that if you, as you have talked about there in Memphis, it can be much harder for organizations serving communities of color or led by people of color to raise local funding. And also, many of our members, whether it's by race or wealth, there's not as much individual philanthropic funding in some communities as there are in others. So if you're serving a wealthy community in philanthropy, in a nonprofit just as well in commercial media, you have some advantages. So I think the mixes, we're not saying the mix, we're just going to lift all boats in the same way. We don't think that'd work. And one of the things that Courtney is doing with Newsmatch tremendously is looking, what levers do we have? What are the different needs in different kinds of communities and organizations? So I think, as you see, we just do these big pie charts, right? Local, state, national. It's now getting into more divisions within that, and that we're really, it's a young field. I think from Index and from the Newsmatch data, we're just starting to see like the different threads to pull and experiment with. So I don't want to sound glib when I say we have to just increase the pie for everyone. We do, but there's a lot within that. Beyond that, we need to do. That's just the kind of table stakes.